Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. This discussion is recorded as part of our 10 video show, actually, as part of our activities, which are meant to showcase, to unpack the developments surrounding the Reform and Growth Facility for the Western Balkans. We are halfway through the implementation of the facility, and it's a great moment, actually, one day after the deadline of 30th of June to record this exchange. With us today, we have Dominic Hatiar, who is the head of sector at the Western Balkans Reform and Growth Facility in DGNS in Brussels. Milena Mihailovic-Danic, who is the program director at the European Policy Center in Belgrade, one of the partners on the Western Balkans Reform and Growth Monitor project. And Krisela Hachkai from the Cooperation and Development Institute from Tirana, who has been our partner in many projects and is one of the leading experts on also assessing the financial assistance of the EU in a broader context than the Reform and Growth Facility that I mentioned before. We'll try to manage this as a conversation. I would start with, I have 3 topics that we would like to cover. Basically, what has been achieved so far and what is the road ahead. What has been the role of civil society in this process? How have monitoring frameworks and indicators developed? How much was it possible to develop them within the given circumstances? What were the challenges? And how can we actually, what are the recommendations from many of the monitoring and consultation formats that we see across the region? Both Krisela and Milena have regional experience, so I think that we'll try to reflect also more broadly rather than the specific countries they come from. I'll start with Dominic. If we take a step back and reflect in maybe 3 minutes, what is the assessment of the Commission of this last year and a half, or maybe longer, we can even count to at this halfway point of implementation of the Reform and Growth Facility for the Western Balkans?
Thank you, Simonida. So to start, I would return back in time to when the Commission put forward the growth plan for the Western Balkans. Composed of the 4 pillars, so gradual integration, regional integration, reforms, and the 4th pillar, the additional financial assistance in the form of the facility. And already a big success is that we've succeeded in innovating the way we approach the region through the growth plan. We've put forward a regulation that was agreed on by the co-legislators. So the member states decided to provide the region with additional funding on top of the existing MFF to drive this new growth plan and the initiative. Subsequently, we had all the partners, except Bosnia and Herzegovina, putting forward their draft reform agendas in line with the regulation requirements. We have been able to negotiate and assess those and adopt them. And last year, Bosnia and Herzegovina was also able to catch up. And it now also has a binding reform agenda adopted. Why is it important? Because these are supposed to be national documents where the country has an ownership behind them. They need to be approved by the government, by the parliament. So this is something that is supposed to steer the reform momentum within the countries. And based on that, we have been able to start gradually first disbursing the 7% of the pre-financing that allows the partners to start up with the activities, and they have been able to come forward with the actual reporting against the reform steps. As of now, we already completed 3 reform reporting rounds. We have the next reporting coming in 2 weeks, so we are really midway. The numbers are improving. Of course, there is big heterogeneity between the partners depending on their institutional dynamics and political context, but we see the numbers currently improving. For the best performers, we expect to go above 70% based on the reporting to be submitted in 2 weeks' time. And North Macedonia is expected to be above 50%, Serbia between 30 and 40%. Now, the big question mark is with Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina. To some extent, because of different reasons, they have missed the first train going to the destination of the facility implementation. But I would say there are connecting trains or later trains also departing. Both of the partners have still a chance to catch up from the current 0% that they are at. Kosovo will be submitting their first reporting now. Bosnia and Herzegovina still, we encourage them to ratify the facility and the loan agreements so that they are eligible to receive the pre-financing and go ahead with the reporting.
Thank you. I think it's a good moment to bring Krisela, because Krisela was writing together with Milena a couple of years ago already the opinion for the European Economic and Social Committee on also the regulations for the facility and more broadly on CSO participation. If I pose the same question to you, where are we? What are the things that are standing that would be coming to your mind immediately?
Thank you, Simonida. Hello, everybody. It was 2 years ago. The regulation was not yet adopted at the time, so it was a draft regulation that we were looking at with Milena and the European Economic and Social Committee, which, as you know, is the body that gathers basically civil society organizations, business, private sector representatives and employers. And it's actually the first institution that opened the door for civil society organizations to participate in their work. So this was our entry point, basically, to understand better these draft regulations that was put forward by the Commission. At the time, we were focused on the spirit of the regulation mostly. So it was about bringing a tangible financial contribution to the region. Actually, it came as a let's say the announcement. It was actually in Bratislava from von der Leyen at the time to bring this new, let's say, plan, which was backed by this facility with the 6 billion euro to respond and to address the let's say since many years, basically the voice from the region to step up the funding for investments, but also for reforms. So this was kind of the response by the Commission. So we had a look at the spirit of this regulation to understand whether it responded to what the countries from the region were requesting at the time. And secondly, we had a look at the first, let's say, features, or as the first, let's say, governance, I would say, characteristics of this new facility, because it was, for us, coming from the region, the first type of instrument, performance-based one, while the member state had since 2021 the Recovery and Resilience Facility, so they had more experience in implementing such instrument. So we wanted to have a more, let's say, involvement of civil society organization in the design. This was our first, let's say, concern, and we embedded this in the regulation, in the opinion. We wanted to have monitoring committees because the first draft regulation actually was not foreseeing monitoring committees under this facility. So this was also something that when the final, of course, version of the regulation was adopted, then we had as well the monitoring committees, but also the scoreboards, which was not existing in the first regulation draft, and then was inserted as also good examples, also coming from the Recovery and Resilience Facility, to be embedded in this regulation, and other, let's say, elements that were for us relevant at the time to understand better the functionality, let's say, mechanism of this new facility, but also to ensure that we could then monitor. So we could have some fixed, let's say, benchmarks in the regulation that could allow civil society organizations, but not only civil society organizations, also private entities, but also, I don't know, we also voiced, for example, the application of the partnership principles, for example, to be eventually taken into account when setting up the monitoring committees, so looking a bit more also at the cohesion policy, let's say, elements that we could apply to a new instrument coming in the region. So those were, at the time, let's say, our main, items that we looked at. And we were happy that with the final regulation, we could see certain elements also coming from the European Parliament, because it was mentioned, it went under a trilogue procedure. So it was negotiated between the Council, the Commission, and the European Parliament. So it was done in a very fast way. We understood this. Also, it was mentioned before the fact that actually the consultation didn't occur at the same level for all the countries. So some countries maybe had more consultation, but some didn't. So these were our main concerns at the time. So we were happy that we saw regulation coming closer to the concern coming from the civil society perspective, but also from the European Parliament perspective, meaning more oversight on the governance arrangements of this regulation. Then we worked on the second opinion as well, which came later, but that looked more at the not just the facility, the Reform and Growth Facility for the Western Balkans, but also to the Moldova and Ukraine facility. This was adopted in April this year and came actually again with the European Economic and Social Committee, requested by the Cyprus presidency of the EU, and looked in different moment in time, because it looked after we had a year and a half, so to say, implementation in our case, so in the Reform and Growth Facility for the Western Balkans. In the case of Ukraine and Moldova, different timing, because they were, in the case of Ukraine, adopted earlier, and then Moldova adopted later than ours. But then we tried to combine in one opinion what we have now on the ground in terms of implementation, lessons learned from implementation, basically. So the second opinion looks at implementation progress, but also tries to lay, let's say, some forward-looking recommendation when it comes to the how this facility actually could help shape a better global Europe, because we are now at a time that the EU is discussing the future budget, and within this future budget, it's also the budget that comes for the Western Balkans. So we want in the new budget to have the best, let's say, that we have from IPA, but also from the RGF, and to mitigate the negative, because of course it's not everything, it's not perfect. So we also want to address the let's say the bad, so to say, the bad cases that we had under implementation for the two facilities. So the second one looks more into the implementation cycle and provides like forward-looking recommendation for the European Commission and for the Council to do their, let's say, work in the future months when it comes to the global Europe.
Thank you. Thank you, Krisela. Moving on to Milena. Krisela mentioned the monitoring. So a year and a half into the facility, you have been working on monitoring various aspects of EU policies and implementation in the candidates. Also developed a lot of methodologies. Serbia is also one of the examples where we have a monitoring committee where counterintuitively maybe, but civil society through the convention has an actual member rights position. So if you had the same question, if we look with these issues in mind of now where do we stand this year and a half, we would love to hear it. Thanks.
Thank you, Simonida, and I'm really happy to be here for this important and I think very timely conversation. Serbia is an example of a country that has probably now the best setup system, but probably not the best example in terms of actual implementation. So I will mainly focus on the actual setup of how we are doing monitoring and how we are assessing it at this point in time, not so much about the actual implementation of reforms, which is a completely different story. But just for those who are not from Serbia, just a little bit of a context. Serbia has been entangled for almost 2 years, over 1.5 years, in a very deep societal crisis and polarization. That started November the 1st last year, when a canopy of the railway station in Novi Sad collapsed and killed 16 people. That led to the largest wave of anti-corruption protests that the country has seen in decades. And somehow throughout this crisis, civil society has managed to emerge as a very strong pro-European voice, which is insisting on transparency, which is insisting on, let's say, candid implementation of reforms across all areas. And this is, I think, what gave us the strength, and also which kind of caused very strong support coming both from Brussels, from DG Enest, and from the EU delegation in Serbia, to accept the requests of the Serbian civil society, especially the National Convention on the EU, which is the formal, let's say, platform of civil society organizations participating in the EU accession process. They were very keen to accept our requests to be meaningfully included and involved in the monitoring of the RGF. We were very clear and determined not to accept to participate in any sort of a monitoring process, which would just be, I don't know, to show to the international public that civil society is involved without actually giving us a voice. And this is why we insisted on having full membership of the monitoring committee, because we considered that this would guarantee not only full participation, but also access to information, access to documents, etc. And considering where we started from, that the consultations on the draft reform agenda were, well, close to none. I mean, there was one discussion at the Serbian Parliament, which included both members of the EU Integration Committee of the Parliament and representatives of the National Convention on the EU. But we were just provided the draft. Not even the entire reform agenda, just that Excel annex. We were provided it a week before this consultation, and we were requested not to share it with the rest of the civil society. Despite that, the civil society organizations that were engaged in the process provided a lot of comments, and almost none of them were accepted. And now actually we're seeing the consequences of the fact that these consultations were not done properly, because, for example, we have one particular reform step, and I can come back to that in the discussion maybe if there is interest, which is very ambiguous, and where still between civil society, government, and the Commission, we cannot agree, what is the actual interpretation. Of course, the Commission at the end will decide what is the interpretation, but it's a really problem of the drafting, and despite the fact that civil society provided a comment specifically to clarify that point, it was just not accepted. So this is where we started from, and now I think we have achieved to really have full participation. As I said, I am representing the Serbian civil society in the monitoring committee as a full member. We also have participation rights, so additional members of the convention and of our working group, which is monitoring the reform agenda, also participate in the meetings. We have also been very insistent to have regular technical meetings. So far we have also had 2 technical trilateral meetings, as we call them, in the Serbian context, where we discuss the ongoing reforms in the ongoing payment period. So we just had one in May this year, which was basically where we discussed with the government and the representatives of the Commission and EU delegation the progress on the reform steps, which are due June, which were due yesterday. I think that so far we have managed, through regular communication, through issuing of the monitoring reports. We issued one comprehensive monitoring report covering the whole scope of the Serbian reform agenda for all the reform steps that were due until December 2025. Also through an established written procedure, which we also kind of set up after the first meeting of the monitoring committee. We agreed that we can also do things through a written procedure. So through regular exchanges, constant, sometimes you have to be repetitive, you have to constantly remind, especially the government institutions, whether they have committed to something in the meetings and then they haven't followed up, etc. So, for example, we managed to get the government to publish all the payment requests just a month ago. Before that, Montenegrin government was the only one that was publishing the payment requests, and with a lot of negotiation, with a lot of insistence, and also a lot of support coming from colleagues from DG Enest and the EU delegation, we managed also to get all the payment requests fully published. For us, for example, that was one of the key obstacles for our monitoring work because we could not determine what the government had actually claimed. We would only receive the list of the reform steps that they were reporting on, but nothing on the substance. So I think that, we are all kind of learning through this process. We are all adapting also our negotiation and our approaches. But I think that at this point, in terms of the process that we have set up, I think that we can really say with confidence that civil society has attained the role that it should have, especially in a sensitive reform context, such as in Serbia. And considering where we started from, I think that we can be happy with the progress and the achievement that we have made.
Thank you. Going back to Dominic, I think we outlined what civil society does. How much of this does the Commission use, in your view? How can we make our messages maybe conveyed better? How much do you value actually independent civil society monitoring in such technical, complex processes, often at times running against the deadlines? We're all very well aware also of the challenges of taking everyone's opinions on board. So if there's any also advice on how we can do this better, it would be beneficial, I think, for the whole room down the road.
Absolutely. So there are two phases where civil society needs to be involved and have attain its role as it's been said by Milena. And the first phase, which we've just discussed, and this is already unfortunately water under the bridge, but it is an important reflection that we need to have and a lesson for the future, is the design phase. Because again, this is supposed to be always the reform agenda, a national document owned by the public with, to the degree possible, a cross-party consensus on that document and a buy-in from the local authorities, from the civil societies. And such an outcome is possible only when there is a proper public debate, when there is a discussion, and then when there is a adequate public consultation process with an iterative process followed after those consultations where you submit input. The authorities react. They, of course, have to take decisions. They have to prioritize, but at least you receive feedback on the input that is submitted. Unfortunately, this was not ideal when the reform agendas were designed. In part also because it was done at the very last minute during the midterm review of the next MFF. So the time horizon was limited. And for the next MFF, when we speak about the new reform agendas coming in as of 2028, we need to benefit from the fact that we will have more time and that we need to perhaps have a more structured process with more robust assessment requirements imposed by the European institutions on how this design process of the reform agendas is supposed to be and how is it supposed to be inclusive, and then rigorous assessment also by the Commission whether that process actually met those standards that we will impose. So I think that's the first lesson learned, and also an invitation to you to look forward to the future for the formulation of the new reform agendas. Now, more concretely towards your project and what you're doing there now on the monitoring, I would first mention the concept of reversibility of reforms. So every single decision that is taken by the Commission, it's as transparent as we can be because it's published. It is out there for you to see what are the evidences and what is the evidence and what is the assessment that we've taken of a particular reform. And the government is accountable to continue implementing those reforms throughout the lifetime of the facility, even after the achievement. So should you be in a situation where the reform is not implemented, should you know that, okay, we might have been misled by certain evidence provided by the governments, or you might identify a mistake made by the Commission in their assessment, All of this is very relevant information that you are invited to channel to us through the EU delegations and through the respective monitoring committees where you are involved. And then there is another part which is maybe a bit more forward-looking on the steps that are due. What we really appreciate is also information where you can flag to us that, okay, we see a major risk for this reform that is in the grace period in 3 months, but the government hasn't even started working on the law. So also having this anticipative approach of informing us, providing us with new sources of information, new analysis that might not be available to us or might not be shared by the governments with us, so that we have an accurate view of the risks and an accurate view of the situation on the ground from someone else than just the government authorities.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that. Chrisela, how do you react to this? So do you think that civil society was proactive enough from this year and a half? What possibly could we have done even maybe better? How feasible was it from your end to actually monitor? How much information was there available? Because we all had our own hurdles of accessing information at times. But that also brings us to the reflection forward. I think to move on, it was very useful of Dominic to mention the forward-looking dimension, because if we're talking about reform agendas in some format 2.0, I think these are the reflections that we need to have now to be prepared jointly in view of that.
Thank you, Simonida, for the question. I need to start from the observation that with the RGF compared to IPA, because we have those two instruments in implementation, we have much more communication than before. The communication, let's say, dimension that was attached to the RGF, completely different from IPA. This has to be recognized, and we welcome it. Second, predictability. Although in the beginning, the full, let's say, picture or the full framework of RGF implementation was not, let's say, completed, but during the way certain pieces of the process were completed by the Commission, but also by the authorities in terms of legal basis, national one that should support the implementation and the monitoring of the facility in the country. I think that now we are in a better position. So this has to be also be recognized. Predictability is very much important when it comes to the private stakeholders, so not the state institution, but the private stakeholders that need to know what this instrument is about, where to access the information, what timeline the process has, which kind of reforms. We are in a better position than compared to IPA. Second, when it comes to Albania, it was mentioned in the previous panel, we have now a much more complete website that we can retrieve information. This was not the case in the very beginning. So again, communication, transparency, it's very much important for civil society actors, but also others to play a role, to position themselves, to understand the process, but also to eventually engage if they are also supported. This also has to be mentioned, that civil society actors, private sector entities, associations, academia, local and regional authorities need to know what the reforms are about, what is the timeline, where they see themselves, because we must admit that in the reform agendas we don't have those stakeholders very, in a clear, let's say, way position there. We have general, let's say, provisions that do, need to ensure basically that those stakeholders are involved. But in terms of practicality, we don't see this happening. We have had just now in early June, the second monitoring committee of the facility in Albania, and we used the opportunity in that committee to voice up what we have observed during monitoring of this facility in the first year or year and a half. There is a possibility, a window of opportunity when it comes to a possible revision, possible amendments. The legal basis is there. It allows for amendment to be made. Of course, if there is a sufficient, let's say, basis for that amendment to be submitted by the countries, of course, in close collaboration with the Commission. This should be used in terms of mitigating a bit the challenges that we had in the very beginning of stakeholder engagement. and this was our call during this monitoring committee, to use this possibility to test the direct support for final beneficiaries other than the government. Now we have a provision in the regulation which says basically that for each final recipient that receives more than 50,000 euro from the facility, there should be transparency in terms of, of the list of these final recipients to be, to be communicated. This hasn't happened, and we heard before that even the ministries have not received the budget in their accounts for the reforms that they have to implement, basically. So we have a window of opportunity to test the direct support under this facility, but also to understand how we can be better prepared for the new MFF, because this will be the case. We will have that kind of performance-based logic be implemented in the new MFF. So since this is I would call transitional, so to say, facility, not a full cycle instrument, so not a 7-year one, but a 4 years one, why don't we use this opportunity to have direct support for civil society engagement, direct support for private companies? In the case of Moldova, we had a public hearing in the European Economics and Social Committee when we were preparing the last opinion that I mentioned before. From the Moldova representative from the business community, they have direct support under their facility. So we have also different standards used and applied in the different facilities. So why not have especially, for example, in the case of Albania, having all the chapters open, and now much more, in deep when it comes to the accession process, more and more concerns about the private sector, about the compliance cost when it comes to them, preparing for the single market. But I would add, we have just IBAR approved, which provides for Albania very clear tasks in terms of. This is also something that we don't see in the reform agenda. And parliamentary oversight is very important because we are having, in the case of our country, a very fast pace of legislation adoption. And there is little, let's say, especially for the laws that are under the European integration, let's say, agenda, there is very little time window to provide meaningful contribution, and also depends sometimes from the line ministries that is, carrying out the consultations. Sometimes we have line ministries that are much more active in carrying out those, especially Ministry of Justice, I must mention, but we have others. I don't know, for example, we had the roundtable organized in April with private sector representatives, 4 ones, and they were very concerned about the electricity law that was adopted in June, because the law had to be, had to undergo different types of consultation, not just one single consultation, because it's such important that provides the pace for the sector for 20, 30 years, meaning that gathering all the insights that we have, let's say, observed during the implementation phase of this facility, gathering as well the concerns from the different stakeholders, we have managed also through a letter that we have prepared with around 30 civil society organizations with regard to the European integration process and the implications that their engagement has when it comes to the efficiency and also legitimacy sometimes of the reforms that are being adopted, to have really a focused, let's say, tailored attention if this revision will be done, to be consulted, of course, but also to take into account as much, of course, it's possible by the technicalities of the facility, because we know it's, it goes through a different cycle and you have a very short timeline for implementation. It can be eventually until 2028 for a revision possibility, but until now it's 2027 as a timeline. So it's a very short time to eventually test something, but I think it's good. We can only learn. Basically, as we learned in the very beginning of the process, we can still learn in the second half, basically, of this facility. So those were, this was our call, basically, during the last monitoring committee, which is also a useful tool, a useful entry point that we must learn to practice, that we must learn to also improve, because in the next, of course, budgetary cycle, we are much more prepared now, because RGF allowed for this kind of involvement of the stakeholders during those in those tools to improve them in the future.
Wonderful. Milana, I think that, we've been discussing very much also the national dimension of the RGF, but you've been working a lot on regional approaches. So I think that in the previous discussions, we did say that the value also of this instrument is that it provides for a regional comparison also on the incentives, on the mobilization and the political will at some times, or the will for reforms at the national level. But I just wanted to ask, what do you see as the benefit of us working as a regional network and trying to develop a regional, at least taking into account the specificities of the countries, but still to have a common approach, which we feel is very important down the road for our region as well. I will, after Milena, open the floor for questions. So just do you have a couple of 3 or 4 minutes if there's any pressing questions that you would like to pose or comments. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think that the RGF is a great example of an instrument that truly benefits from both a national and a combined regional approach. And we see it in Serbia because, and I'm sure that Krisela could confirm this, because they also do this additional monitoring at the national level. For us, this has been extremely important, because at the national level, when we do our monitoring, we are very much focused on the specificities of the Serbian system, of the Serbian problems. And many of those problems are indeed Serbia specific. For example, one of the key recommendations of our first comprehensive report is that the government should refrain from introducing, as part of the legislative and policy interventions stemming from the reform agenda, that they should refrain from introducing measures which are incompatible with the objectives of the RGF. And we have had several examples of the government doing just that. So they open a legislative process in order to implement something from a reform step from the reform agenda, but then they actually sneak in several other interventions that actually go contrary to the reform agenda. And they have actually, this has created a lot of problems, not just for us in the civil society, but also for the Commission. But on the other hand, the regional monitoring allows us to precisely compare the different approaches in different countries in the same areas, and also to compare how the differences within the reform agendas themselves are affecting the implementation and the fulfillment of commitments. And I will just give you one really good example. So Serbia has a lot of exemptions from public procurement. And many of those exemptions for large infrastructural projects are done on country to country, so bilateral intergovernmental agreements, which are completely opaque. Very little information is provided to the public about those contracts. So the first step in this direction in the reform agenda was supposed to be that the government increases the transparency of those contracts. And then the second one, which is due next year, would be to actually stop the use of these bilateral agreements and exemptions from the public procurement. So basically to repeal all the legislation that is providing for these exemptions. Now, Montenegro has a very, very similar step to the one in Serbia. But in Montenegro, the reform step is clearly saying which pieces of information the government needs to provide on each of those contracts. And it only says that the government needs to provide those specific pieces of information. In Serbia, this was probably, again, a mistake done hastily in the drafting process. The comment which was provided by our partners from Transparency Serbia in the drafting phase were not implemented, so that mistake was not corrected. So the Serbian reform agenda actually states that all the contracts based on these bilateral agreements need to be published, and then it goes on to stipulate the exact pieces of information which should be published. The government decided to interpret the step in a minimalistic way. So they have decided to just completely ignore that the step actually says that the contracts have to be published. And they're claiming that the intention of the reform agenda was just to publish these specific pieces of information, which are honestly not really providing for proper transparency. As part of our monitoring work, we have been arguing that the Commission cannot apply the same approach to Serbia and Montenegro here, because simply the Montenegrin reform agenda is drafted differently. And in the case of Serbia, the reform step needs to be interpreted in the substantive way. We cannot, this is both formally and substantively an issue that requires proper interpretation of this. The last information we have from the Commission is unfortunately that they're likely to adopt this minimalist approach. We have, for example, tried again, knowing that in other countries of the region. So again, using these regional exchanges and approach, we know that in other countries, this suggestion to have the amendment of the reform agenda has been put forward. We are also now trying also to put this recommendation forward using, and we will, I mean, to the extent that we can, we will again rely on the examples from other countries. So I think that having a regional approach, having the proper exchange of findings, information, also especially on the consultations and the functioning of the consultation mechanisms, the monitoring committee. I think that this is really helping us get the additional evidence and arguments to argue for the, let's say, best possible implementation of the reform agendas and for the best possible consultations. And it also, just as a last sentence, maybe, it also somehow makes you feel less alone in all the problems and all the difficulties. For us in Serbia, it has landed us also a sense of accomplishment because we have seen that compared to the region in a very difficult institutional environment, we have managed to, push the process forward and have a meaningful participation of the civil society.
Thank you, Milana. I'm very glad that you both mentioned the learning, because I think that that's what for many of us also the work on our project, but now with the grantees will be, because in addition to the specific areas that they will work on, I think that we'll all learn or kind of master new ways of communication, both with the Union, both with the European Union in Brussels, but also with our delegations. Are there any questions, comments, or shall I move to mine? It seems, yes, there are. Wonderful. So can I have a microphone in the back? I think this will be the only opportunity. Here, Dorisa. Yes. It's in your dead corner, so I don't think it was feasible for you to see.
Hello, I'm Maria from Finance Think North Macedonia. My question is for Dominic. So you mentioned how civil society organizations can contribute to the design process and the implementation of the facility. My question is for the future financial cycle, starting from 2028. How do you plan to include civil society organizations? Do you plan to incorporate them in the consultation process? And how do you plan, or maybe how they will be supported financially in the next cycle? Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. We'll take the next question as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the wonderful panel. My name is Amela Kurta, and I'm coming from the Center for Development Evaluation and Social Science Research from Bosnia and Herzegovina. My question is about Montenegro. We heard a lot that they are best performers. Why? In your opinion, what makes them a best performer? And in that sense, what was the role of the civil society in the planning and also in delivering the reforms? And what is the situation now? Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Nope. Okay. I can also reflect from our experience on the Montenegro example, unless Ivana wants to chip in at a certain point. Okay. But yes, thanks, Maria, for sharing the question. Actually, I think that kind of brings us, to wrapping up potentially, because I think that my question was also, what have we learned, and the key lessons that all of you will draw for the new funding cycle, or potentially Krisela mentioned the revisions. If there's something that we already know of what will happen from September, October, we hear discussions on revisions for the facility. I think that it would be good for this last round to touch upon the questions, but also to look at the future. So maybe it's a good point, actually, unless you can also touch up on Montenegro. What I can say from our monitoring work so far, I mean, we've heard the Commission. I don't think that we're going to step in there in the assessment on the percentages. I think that I'll let to Dominic. From our experience, and maybe I think I would start with the fact that Montenegro from the first cycle, I think I mentioned that on the 15th of March 2025, immediately while sending to the Commission the reports, they also published part of their reports on the performance of the facility online, which was actually the wisest thing that one country could do. We are, considering that the request payments in Serbia, we have announcements now in North Macedonia that they will be published. We have the folders online, but still the documents have not been published. And this has made the monitoring work of our colleagues in Montenegro much easier than what was the case in all of the other countries. I mean, this might sound like a small step, but actually it is not. It's basic transparency. What I have seen from my own research on Montenegro is that it's still the country that has, and maybe Milena can here follow up with findings from Weber. On terms of feedback to public consultations, it's one of the countries that still publishes the most proper reports, maybe with arguable quality, but they do have a feedback mechanism on public consultations, which a lot of the countries in the region do not have. So I think that, we oftentimes think of this as procedural issues, but we realize that actually for what is our work, it's very much essential. And we also know that there's much more pressure from the Commission as well, because they're nearing a point that we are not. That there's much more capacity invested also from the delegation, from the Commission, to monitor what is happening on many other areas, and this probably makes it easier for the reform and growth facility as well. I think I'll stop there and remind you of the questions that, if we look forward 3 to maybe 4 or 5 minutes each, what are your key takeaways if we look into the new cycle, or maybe the revisions, if there are any coming up down the road? I think it's a good to start with Dominic.
Okay, thanks a lot. So the question on the future. We are at the stage where the Global Europe proposal has been put forward. It is still being negotiated by the co-legislators. For those of you who've read the proposal, it remains quite open-ended. So the actual details of the implementation modalities will be defined at a later stage by the implementing regulation of the Commission. But what is definitely here to stay is the role of the performance-based plans. When we look at the former MFF, altogether, the European Commission has provided, in terms of grants, around 13 billion euros to the region. And out of that, only 2 billion have been in the form of performance-based funding. So the facility that we've just been discussing. I'm speaking only about the grants, not the loans. So you see that less than 20% was actually implemented through the reforms. And this percentage is definitely set to grow. And we envision that the future programming, the key basis for the future programming of all the funds will need to be based on the plans. So we are all aware that the consultation processes and the legal basis for those consultation processes needs to be much more robust. We need to have much more time to have a proper process and a more rigorous also assessment of the quality and the nature of the consultation process conducted when devising the reform agendas. I've heard some very good ideas on this panel today regarding also the parliamentary oversight, having not only monitoring committees, but also regular parliamentary sessions on the implementation. Perhaps some of the best practices by certain countries in terms of the traffic light systems. So a lot to be learned on. And other lesson learned on the design is also the challenge that we have with the Western Balkan Investment Framework, where with the current design, part of the money that is disbursed against the completion of the reforms goes to the WBIF for the implementation of infrastructure projects. But we see that this doesn't actually work in an ideal way because the funding flow against the performance of reforms is inherently unstable. We do not know by when will the countries complete all the reforms, And this results in uncertain funding for those large infrastructure projects that are implemented by the international financial institutions. And it is these projects that require clarity on the availability of funding from the very start. So what we also want to have is to continue with this second pillar of those investment frameworks with the WBIF, but have a more secure amount of funding from the very right outset for the next 7 years. This is the amounts that we have available in order to increase the predictability of the funding. And then the final third pillar, which will be the most relevant to you, is going to be the continuation of the so-called unconditional support. So everything that we're doing in terms of the civil society facility, what we do on migration, the union programs such as Erasmus. So the Council of Europe program. So the programs that are not going directly to the government authorities, but to the third sector usually. And a final remark and a lesson learned to be inspired by the member state. I heard the call that we need to really try to harmonize the different facilities with the one in Ukraine, with the one in Moldova. So we indeed want to also go the extra step, which we were perhaps not ready to take when designing this facility, is that to have an increased presence of investments within the plans and the reform agendas, so that there is increased ownership and more direct control by the beneficiaries of the actual investments, rather than having everything channeled into the WBIF and the Pillar 2. Thank you.
Well, I think one necessary step based on the lessons from this facility is that we really do need a sort of an ex post assessment or an evaluation of the RGF. I think that such a process for an ex post assessment should start before the end of this year, so that already next spring we have the results. That would not be, let's say, a full ex post assessment. It would be sort of something between the midterm and then ex post assessment. But in order to provide the results and recommendations in time for the development of the new instrument, and especially the new reform agendas or whatever they will be called, I think it would be important to start early with this process and to ensure that this evaluation is done in a multi-stakeholder or an inclusive manner, so that both the business community, the international stakeholders, the civil societies, in addition to the governments, can provide their perspectives on what has worked, what has created problems really for all of us or some of us, and what can be improved for the next cycle. So I think that, as much as we insist on our governments performing assessments in the policy cycle in our context, I think it would be important to apply it here as well. I will just mention some lessons on what actually hasn't been working well in the case of Serbia. For example, we don't have a good distribution of reform steps across the entire duration of the reform agenda. For example, in the area of human capital, until December 2025, we have not had any steps. And there has been no dialogue and no discussion on the human capital at all. So the stakeholders, the government has not provided any information, as if the first time they should start talking about it was May this year, when actually we heard some of the first announcements and analyses of what will be done. And this is where the government actually informed us that some of the indicators and steps they simply cannot achieve because there is no clear baseline. So there were some quantitative steps regarding the improvement of the enrollment in elementary and high school education, and it turns out that they don't have the baseline and they don't know how to measure it. another issue that we have observed is the very inconsistent approach to sources of verification. This has proven to be a nightmare for our monitoring. Even the Commission is not insisting on the government publishing the outcomes and sources of verification on the locations which are stipulated in the reform agenda. But in some cases, I understand that they even cannot insist because the sources of verification don't make sense in the reform agenda. So, okay, this is again a result of the hastiness and extremely fast process of adoption. But for us who are monitoring the reform agendas, we had one reform step where in the first draft of the comprehensive report we published this spring, our assessment was wrong because the reform agenda said that the government needed to provide support for rural infrastructure development in a number of municipalities, that they needed to have at least 10 such projects contracted. The government only published information with the list of those who have been awarded the contracts, but they never published the actual contracts as a source of verification and not in the place where it was stipulated in the reform agenda. In the end, after the intervention from the responsible ministry, we decided to change our assessment, but it required several additional researchers, several days of work to identify and to be able to ascertain that really at least 10 such projects were contracted. So they had to go through the public procurement portal, through the websites of those municipalities and go through loads of documents in order to find those contracts to ascertain that. So really sticking to what is in the reform agenda. I mean, we need a process of the development of the reform agenda, which can ensure that this document is of such quality that then you can really do the monitoring without having these headaches that we are now having. I can say the same about the indicators. The indicators often are so abstract and general that you actually cannot measure the reform step achievement at all based on the indicator from the reform agenda. At least this is the case in the Serbian document. So preciseness, relevance, clarity of the indicators is really, really poor. And essentially the clarity of the reform steps, because it is clear that, I don't have any issue with the intention to have a combination of qualitative and quantitative steps. This is, I think, a good idea. But I think that in some cases, especially quantitative steps were produced without a deeper analysis of what this would entail and how one would, achieve those quantitative outcomes which are stipulated in the reform agenda. And now, retroactively, we are finding out that in some cases, for example, we don't have clear baselines, so we don't know how we will actually measure whether there has been any sort of an improvement on the ground as a basis for the disbursement of the money. And one last thing that we should not omit, especially if these result-based instruments are going to, let's say, represent a larger share of the overall support in the next MFF, this is how the local governments are going to be involved. Currently, we are engaged in one small contract under this LORAI project. So we are now analyzing the Serbian reform agenda and which reform steps are relevant for the local level. But this whole exercise looks more like a way to at least make the local authorities feel a little bit not even involved, but at least that somebody has thought of them at this point in time, where we cannot really take the reverse in time and create reform steps which are properly addressing and involving the local level. So I think that we need to really think proactively, not only about how to involve the civil society, but how to properly involve the local authorities and to make the reform agendas relevant for also local development and not just the central level. So a lot of challenges, a lot of requests coming from different sides. And I think that this is why it would be good to have this kind of, an overall evaluation process, which would start well ahead of the deadlines for the development of the new instruments, so that we can put all this knowledge and all this experience together. We're doing so much great work and finding out, you know, what works and what doesn't work. And I think we should put all that together and ensure that learning from all the countries, we get the best possible result for the next cycle.
I'm afraid the final evaluation will be too late for the MFF, because it has to finish basically implementation, and then also the regulation foresees that final evaluation is carried out actually after 2027, meaning that we need to actually provide our input for the new MFF earlier. And as we heard from our EU delegation representative, pre-programming kind of tour in the region are starting to collect first insights and to kind of embed as much as possible in this moment of the planning, basically. But what I want to connect to what you said, Milena, is that actually this has to be fixed in the next instruments, the indicators framework. Basically, in the case of the Albanian reform agenda, we have around 70% of the, I would call them products, allow me with this term, are outputs. A law that is adopted, a regulation that is adopted, a bylaw that is adopted. We have this kind of, let's say, products that we have to monitor. And it's quite simple, as you can imagine. If a law is adopted by the parliament, then it gets published in the official gazette, and then there is a proof and evidence for the commission to assess that this actually has been carried out. But in terms, and this is really output. This is not result. This is not allowing also the government, but also the other stakeholders to assess impact, whether the reforms. And not all of them can be actually called reforms, because some are really routine type of administrative or governmental, let's say, tasks that normally are carried out with or without a reform agenda. So actually, certain, let's say, number of reforms in the case of Albanian, because I know better this country, of course, in the case of the Albanian reform agenda, can be called actually reforms. And we need to have, as much as possible, clear benchmarks against which to monitor, basically, not just the output level of it, but also the eventual impact. This will be very, very difficult. I don't know whether Commission has thought of how to eventually come up with, let's say, impact evaluation of the facility. It will be, I think, challenging. When it comes to the MFF and the future, I think what is for us relevant, taking into account experience with IPA, 3 editions of IPA, but also the RGF, is fixing the ratio between grants and loans. I think this is important. Currently, reform agendas are supported with loans in our treasury. Well, we think this should not be the case in the future. We need to have, for the reforms, grants. Secondly, it was mentioned, the WBIF, and this is very much, we focus a lot, and you will focus on the reform agenda only, not on the investment part. But actually, this is a kind of a black box. We have been monitoring your economic and investment plan projects, also with organizations from the region that are also some of them present here in the past, and it's so difficult to enter monitoring in that box. And I'm happy to hear that there is a reflection going on. We know already, and we look forward to see connectivity investments, infrastructure investments in general, addressing more and more the human capital, the social, let's say, and economical development, rather than, I don't know, the classical sectors that we have already had a lot, which is transport, energy. Not that they are not important, they are a lot important, but we have had so many issues with those projects and with the maturity of the projects and with the loans and the guarantees, the sovereign guarantees that all the beneficiary countries have to provide, and the cycle that takes a lot of time to from when you plan or when you adopt, let's say, a decision for an investment project to be adopted, and then when you actually see the project on the ground to take, like we have the Tirana-Durrës Railway, approved 2016. Probably next year, eventually, we will have this railway operating. So it takes time, not that it's not needed, but it takes time. But we need to see more, let's say, focus on the social, economical, health sectors. These are really important to go in parallel with the rest of the sectors and are underrepresented in terms of financing within the WBIF portfolio. The other aspect is to connect the connectivity and investment infrastructure development in our regions to the industrial policy, to the economic policy. There should be very clear criteria why a road is needed and why it is producing, economic opportunities for a certain area, and whether, it produces tangible, let's say, opportunities for companies and so on. So this linkage with the implications in terms of economic and social development for connectivity and investment infrastructure in the regions should be the case to be fixed in the next MFF. Last point. We would like to see more country-tailored, so to say, approach, especially in non-conditional part of the support, because each and every country has its own pace of, let's say, progress in the accession process. And I don't know, for example, if I take the case of Albania, we might need certain focus on, I don't know, a certain domain, I don't know, can be rule of law, can be good governance and so on, but less in others. Maybe another country has to have more, let's say, focus, I don't know, Montenegro, for example, closing all the chapters by this year, to have focus on preparing them for, for the cohesion, for the structural funding. So that kind of, let's say, elements in mind to address the pace where the countries are. And I think this should be also to go in parallel with the member states funding, in terms of they have now both the national and the regional partnership plans that puts together the cohesion and the agriculture funding that we used to have before, but also the competitiveness fund. I would like to see in the member states budget as well an enlargement window, because if the member states are preparing their policies and their budget with enlargement in mind, it means that we are seeing, member states really preparing for enlargement to take place, basically. So not just global Europe, let's say, only focused insight from our countries, but also insights into the member states' policies as well. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a long wish list. But thank you both for sharing the recommendations. I think that we look forward, actually, I think we'll extend that wish list with what will be the recommendations from our grantees by next year, and try to share it as regularly as we can through all venues with the Commission, but also with our national governments, because I think it's also a question that, they step up with these requests as well, rather than this coming from civil society, because a lot of the issues that you mentioned on the indicators and on the sources is also a common job with the governments, because these are our documents at the end of the day. If there's one word that was, I think, stayed with me, it was actually learning. So I think that, we should have maybe called this workshop Learning Together. But I want to thank you for the conversation, because I think we all learned from each other, and we're hoping that it will continue, not until the end of the project, but further on.